Well, hello and welcome to week 10 of Early Christian History, and we're going to be looking at three different stories today as we continue into the Dark Ages, looking at some of the early year figures there. We're going to start off with someone named Columba. Now, you remember a couple of weeks ago where we highlighted St. Patrick and his missionary work in Ireland. Columba is kind of the opposite story. He was the Scottish equivalent of St. Patrick. He came from Ireland and went to Scotland and cemented a legacy of spreading Christianity throughout Scotland and really advancing the cause of Christianity, and in the process creating really some of the only enduring art that the Dark Ages produced, or at least the art that survived. Again, as we talked about the Dark Ages, one of the reasons we call them the Dark Ages is because in Western Europe, where our history focus or immediate focus begins, there wasn't a heck of a lot of art being produced. Art is a luxury when you can take care of eating and sleeping and surviving. So the fact that we do have some pieces of art and literature and whatnot that survived the Dark Ages, what few we have are precious to us. And Columba indirectly was responsible for that. We'll explain why. He was born in Ireland and was a devout guy. He was the son of some clergy. Evidently, he had a pretty hot temper, though. He helped set up several monasteries in Ireland, but evidently got into an argument of sorts with another warlord in Ireland. Kind of a complicated story, but the long story short, it led to a battle amongst their respective armies where 3,000 men were killed. Columba, after he had calmed down, was devastated at what happened. The fact that 3,000 people died because he and another guy got into a disagreement. He made the resolve then, he made the promise then to God that he was going to convert at least 3,000 people to Christianity to make up for the 3,000 people lost in that battle. And he decided to go outside of Ireland. Again, Ireland, thanks to the efforts of St. Patrick, was pretty well on its way to becoming pretty well Christianized throughout the country. He decided on Scotland. And as you can see on the map here, it's not like he went to the ends of the earth. Ireland and Scotland are on different islands, but they are both part of modern day, what we call the Great British Isles, and really just a little bit of sea between them. Columba, like we said, did not have to travel far. It was the year 563 when he went to Scotland. And one thing about Scotland you don't think about is the fact that there's a whole lot of islands that dot around the Scottish mainland. Matter of fact, the total coastline, when you include all the islands of Scotland, makes it one of the countries in the world that has some of the largest coastal property. Now, it's not a lot of beachfronts, a lot of rocks, not a lot of vacation spots in Scotland along the ocean, but there's a boatload of islands out there. And he settled on some of those. Now, the people that were populating Scotland at the time were called the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, and it was Latin for painted people. Again, we have this image of people from Scotland being the strong Caucasian types. They were evidently in the Dark Ages. The Picts were pretty wild. They liked to paint their bodies, so therefore they were named that by the Romans and the others that visited, for one reason or another, the British Isles. The Picts had a reputation for being very fierce fighters. Other Scots living in the land feared them, and they were kind of rooting for Columba to convert these wild barbarians. Here's that word again. Anyone who ain't like me is a barbarian. Their leader was a man named Brude. It's like rude with a B at the beginning. And he bolted his village gates to keep Columba out when the Columba first came knocking on his door to try to, like a Jehovah's Witness, hey, can I talk to you about Jesus Christ? But the story goes, and this is almost certainly legend and not fact, but the story goes, Columba made a sign of the cross on the locked gates and the gates flew wide open for him, and he walked in. Not quite the parting of the Red Sea, but something along those lines. Evidently, however he got in there, Brood sort of changed his mind and began at least to listen to Columbia and to his people. And as it turned out, the Picts were very receptive. That was just the beginning of Columbia's ministry in Scotland. He set up monasteries for teaching and for serving the people there. His greatest influence, though, was the monastery he set up on the island of Iona. This small island was, just through a whole bunch of circumstances, became almost the epicenter of Christian thought and art in the Dark Ages, again, such as they were during that time. The Scottish monastery became a model for others. And Iona, the monastery there, became a great center of thought. So much so that over the course of the intervening 1,500 years, 46 different Scottish kings requested to be buried on the island of Iona, as Columbia was, because of, again, the religious influence that stemmed from that island. The monks at Iona did a great service insofar as they painstakingly copied as many copies of the Bible as they could. They didn't have a Xerox. They didn't have a 3D printer. They had to write it all by hand. And the monks at Iona became legendary for producing just so many copies of the Vulgate, the Bible that was being used at the time in the Catholic Church. And they became very famous for that, but they also became famous for their art. They used these brightly illuminated letters that you've probably seen copied in other forms of art. The monks at Iona produced the Book of Kells, which still survives to this day and is just a beautiful visual feast, along with being a Bible, which makes it very unique at the time. Again, illiteracy was high; only a few people could read, but those who could had something that they could feed their soul and their artistic vent as well. So, though Scotland was a very small country, became a very influential one, simply because the Christians of Scotland were so proficient at spreading the gospel. And Scotland's roots in Christianity were very well established, particularly the monastery on the island of Iona. Let's move about 10,000 miles to the east or so, and talk about early Japan during this time. Again, Dark Ages were dark predominantly for Western Europe. There were other parts of the globe that were thriving at this time of history, and Japan was one of them. Japan, again, if you're not familiar with it, it is a chain of islands. An archipelago is the word. There are 4 main islands to Japan, the 4 bigger ones, and there are 4,223 small islands that make up Japan. There are a boatload of them, but not even maybe a tenth of them are actually occupied today. A lot of them are nothing more than rocks in the ocean, but this is a coastal community. And 2 residents of Japan, there were the natives that we'll talk about in a minute, and those that came from the mainland. Again, at one time, Japan's islands were connected by land to the Asian mainland. So a lot of from China and Korea and whatnot drifted over into Japan over time. Now, just a little background here to try to explore the Japanese mindset, because again, because they were on an island, they got to, remember how we talked about the Mayan civilization kind of developing independent of any outside influence? Japan had a lot of that too, even though there was some intermingling with others, very limited. The Japanese mythological creation legend goes that a brother and sister in the heavens were commanded by their elders to create the islands of Japan. From a bridge in heaven, they drew a jeweled sword out of the ocean, and every droplet of water that came down became an island that made up Japan. They called these sacred islands Nippon, Nippon, which means source of the sun. We call it Japan because it's a shortened name of the name that Marco Polo, whom we'll talk about later, used for the islands. He called it Cipango, and it eventually got shortened to Japan. And that's the way the Western world recognized the island. And you still, if you go to Japan or if you meet someone from Japan and ask them the name of their country, they will say Nippon. But we call it Japan, just one of those things. There's very little documented history of early Japan, that is to say before the Dark Ages or so. The first known emperor that we have was someone named Jimmu Tenno, who lived about 600 BC. So in terms of tangible history, that's about as far back as we can go. Japan was ruled by scattered clan leaders, much like the way Western Europe became after the Roman Empire. All these little kingdoms, fiefdoms, duchies, and whatnot. Japan was like that for many years. A lot of just basically scattered clan leaders all throughout the four main islands. In the year 400, Yamato's clan, the Yamato clan, gained some control over all the other clans. And for the first time, much like with the Roman Empire in Europe, you had this sort of unifying rule. Ever since then, the imperial rulers of Japan have claimed to be from the Yamato clan. But it was really the first time there was anything close to, single government rule for the Japanese people. Again, we're talking 400 AD. As for the Japanese faith, one of the oldest religions in the world is Shinto. And it means way of the gods in Japanese. It's one of the oldest religions in the world, and it originated in Japan. It holds that there is a sacred energy behind everything called the kami. If that sounds a lot like, if you're a Star Wars fan, the Force, yeah, think about it sort of like that. A sacred energy behind everything, be it gods, nature, or even the emperor. It's not so much religion as it is a set way of belief, a belief of life, sort of a life motto, so to speak. It is a religion, but unlike other religions, there's not, ritual or scripture or things like that. The Shinto, though, the way of the Shinto, does require complete loyalty to Japan and its emperor. That makes Shinto very unique among religions. No other country in the world has adopted the Shinto religion because it claims Japan was created as a sacred place. You hear the similarities a little bit to the Jewish assertion that they are God's chosen people. Shinto is very much like that insofar as it sees the islands of Japan, Nippon, as sacred. And it claims that Japan alone was created as the world's one sacred place. So that's why Shinto is not popular anywhere else other than Japan. The kamikaze pilots of World War II, if you're familiar with them, they were the pilots who willingly crashed planes into American ships to do damage, but of course killing themselves in the process. They were very much of the Shinto origin. And you can see, again, that melding between religion and the state, where the emperor is worshipped as a god on earth. And you can see the fanaticism that would breed for someone who was a true believer. In 574, a prince was born that would bring a new religion to Japan and really a whole lot of other ideas. His name was Shotoku Taisei. I'm not going to ask you to remember the pronunciation, but yeah, Shotoku Taisei, the first major figure of what we would call modern-day Japan. He introduced Buddhism to the islands of Japan. He was the son of a Japanese emperor. Because of a political conflict, his uncle, I believe, or actually his aunt, became the emperor, but Prince Shotoku was very influential under his aunt's emperorship, so much so that he was called a crown prince. He had the respect and authority of a king, even though he did not have the official lineage. He was a strong follower of Buddha, a religious teacher from ancient times. He spread his Buddhist beliefs all over Japan, supporting the building of monasteries and temples. Buddhism, again, is an old religion and is still practiced very widely today. It, much like Shinto, looks upon the force of good, and it does not have scriptures per se, but it does have the quotes of Buddha. Shotoku was considered a great humanitarian by the people of Japan. He wrote history, he painted pictures, he oversaw the building of the Horyuji Temple, one of the greatest masterpieces of early Japan. He wrote what, for lack of a better term, is a constitution for Japan. He started the idea of having a central government in Japan, so this is like their founding father, so to speak. Prince Shotoku, I always get the O's and the U's mixed up, Shotoku, is credited with being really the founder of modern Japanese civilization. There was a great reform that was enacted after his death, following all the reforms, political reforms that he started, where people were said that they paid their taxes directly to Shotoku. So if you were a government, this guy who's now dead, who was very popular, his memory still is strong, you're kind of adopting, hey, if you're paying taxes, you're honoring Shotoku, whatever. Anyway, if you look around, there are lots of examples of the Buddhist architecture that Shotoku oversaw, and Buddhism is the dominant religion in Japan today, but the Shinto, the original religion, is also still advanced. And again, the Japanese people, because they developed independent of a lot of outside sources, makes them a very unique people. But again, you get an idea a little bit about the moral foundations of Japan. And again, they were doing fairly well during the Western European Dark Ages. Let's go back to Western Europe and look at really one of these guys that he's almost too good to be true. When you look back at historic figures, there's always a skeleton in the closet or something they did or something that certainly today we might not favor. Pope Gregory the Great, as he's called, is one of those peoples that, again, it's almost too good to be true, just the good that he did. He was born, again, we talked about this earlier, where around 400 they decided that whoever the Archbishop of Rome was would be the main Archbishop of the entire church. And they began calling him Papa, Pope. And so they retroactively went back to all the previous archbishops of Rome and said, okay, well, Peter, he of the discipleship of Jesus, was the first archbishop of Rome, more or less. So retroactively, Peter is the first pope. But it wasn't until the 5th century that the word pope was really used. And this was after the fall of the Roman Empire. You'll also hear the terms pontiff and the papacy used to describe the pope and the ruling system under the pope. And of course, as the Christian church became more popular and more widespread, the power of the pope continued along with that, and it became a very great power. And as we'll see in subsequent lessons, not every one of the popes was a very good pope. But let's look at Gregory. He was born actually of a fairly well-to-do family, inherited a lot of money and prestige from his parents. He actually inherited a palace of his own. This guy was rich. At the age of 33, he became the mayor of the city of Rome, which even after the end of the Roman Empire was still a major city of commerce and trade. After one term, he decided he did not like politics whatsoever, and really, he didn't just dislike it, he just began to get a distaste of what he saw as all the evil around him. It was, of course, in the middle of the Dark Ages, so there was a whole lot of misery going on around him, I suspect. He turned his luxurious palace home into the monastery of St. Andrew, and he took on the vows and the lifestyle of a lowly monk. He basically took a vow of poverty while converting his palatial home, literal palace, into a monastery. Now, can you imagine a major rich politician today renouncing all their wealth and their power and prestige and becoming a priest at some small Catholic church somewhere? It would be sort of like that. He still had a passion for travel, though, and share the gospel of Christ. He wanted to be a missionary, but the church saw his many, many talents, particularly his talent at organization, and decided, nah, you can do us more good by staying here and leading the monasteries and the efforts that you've already done. As the years went by, again, this guy continued to minister to everyone and was doing a lot of good. I mean, doing all the right things. And when the Pope died in 590, Gregory was cited very quickly as the most likely to fill the empty position of Pope. He didn't want to be the Pope. He was 50 years old at this point. He thought he was serving God where he could serve him best, as a monk, as a leader of a monastery. Accepting the position of Pope would mean he had tremendous power and authority. Being a Pope in those days was like being a king. He struggled with the idea, but to solve it, he said he would take the position of Pope, but only if he would be able to maintain his simple lifestyle as a monk. So he would be the head of this vast church, but he would still be living the lifestyle of a monk. He would continue to dress in the plainest of robes, live in simple quarters, eat basic food, fast. And of course, I mean, if you're familiar with the image we have of the Pope, the big hats and the Vatican and all of its splendor, wow, what a guy. What a super guy. Gregory chose to live the simple life. The legacy he left as Pope, though, was not simple at all. He made tremendous decisions and advancements for the church before medieval period. His ability as a pope, that is to say, as a leader of a large church, was just as good as he was. He was very good at it. Again, in addition to being a very humble person, obviously, he was also very good at being pope. And there's something to be said for that. He gained a lot of respect as a civil leader as well as a religious leader. Even with this great power, his Gregory the Great's heart remained pure to his original passion of helping the lost. There's a story about him that goes like this. While passing through the market in Rome one day, Gregory saw a group of slaves being unloaded from England. He was struck by the way they looked. He asked if these people knew anything about Christianity. He was told no, that they were Angles. Remember them? One of the groups that really was one of the invaders of the British continent. He said, no, they don't look like Angles. They look like angels to me. And though he could not leave Rome to preach the gospel, he sent the Augustine of Canterbury to do the job. And they established the Canterbury Diocese in England, which still exists today and is still the most influential English diocese of the Catholic Church. He founded at least 7 monasteries even after becoming Pope. And again, by all accounts, he always gave priority to the poor and the oppressed, of which there were many during the Dark Ages. People in the city of Rome, and again, such was Gregory's influence, again, he was once a mayor of Rome, they received a month's worth of food, clothing, money. If they were too sick to get their food, it was delivered to them. He personally wrote hundreds of letters of encouragement to those in need. He was all that and much more. About as good a godly person as you can find. It ain't hype with Gregory. Gregory the Great was actually great. He wrote training manuals for bishops that were used for hundreds of years. One of his famous quotes is, "Every preacher should give forth a sound more by his deeds than by his words, and rather by good living imprint footsteps for men to follow, than by speaking show them the way to walk." Sounds a lot like St. Francis of Assisi's famous saying, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. They will know we are Christians by our love." Gregory embodied that. The famous Gregorian chants were modeled after Pope Gregory. He was very fond of music during Mass. And the Gregorian chants were eventually renamed in his honor because he so encouraged that musical style. He demonstrated a true servant heart. Again, history is littered with people who were a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. 99.9% of the population is like that, and I'm sure Gregory was a sinner just like all of us, but boy, hard to find any skeletons in his closet. Pope Gregory, Gregory the Great, one of the true greats of the Dark Ages. Hopefully you're feeling great on Monday when we meet and talk about this. We'll see you then.